It happened on Christmas night, right when the candles on the table flickered against the polished silverware, and the smell of roasted turkey filled the room, when my father raised his glass and, instead of giving the usual toast, looked directly at me with a cold, flat stare, and said the words that split my world in half. "You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." For a moment, I thought he was joking, that maybe the wine had loosened his tongue, but the silence that fell over the table was too sharp, too real, and every face turned toward me. My siblings with pity, thinly disguised as curiosity, my mother, frozen with her fork halfway to her mouth, and me, sitting there as though I'd been caught in some spotlight I never asked for. It was supposed to be a night of warmth, laughter, and family. Yet it became the night I realized that my place, in this house, was conditional, fragile, and ready to be stripped away in front of everyone I loved. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just sat there, my chest heavy, the words echoing, and in that silence, I made the quiet decision that would change everything. I would get up, walk out, and leave behind not just the table, but the life I had been clinging to for too long. As I pushed my chair back, the scrape of its legs against the hardwood seemed louder than anything else in the room, louder even than my father's words, still hanging like smoke above the table, and I felt every pair of eyes drilling into my back. My little nephew dropped his spoon with a clatter, but nobody moved to pick it up. Nobody dared break the tension that my father had created, and I realized in that instant that I had been cast as the villain in a story I hadn't written. Took my coat from the hook by the door, my fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the weight of humiliation pressing down on me. And when I glanced back, I saw my brother shaking his head ever so slightly, as if to warn me not to cause a scene, as if my silence would make everyone more comfortable. That was the moment clarity hit me. I had been living in this house like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, tiptoeing around rules I never agreed to, working twice as hard to prove myself, and yet somehow always being seen as less. My father's words weren't born at that dinner table. They had been brewing for years in the sighs, when I came home late, in the disappointed glances when my career didn't look like my brother's, in the way he praised my sister for every small thing, while my victories went unnoticed. So when he finally spoke those words aloud, he didn't just disown me. He confirmed what I had feared, but never admitted. I had never really belonged. I stepped into the night air, sharp and freezing against my skin, and with every crunch of snow under my boots, I felt a strange mix of grief and liberation. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was unwanted, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain, a quiet flame of resolve began to burn. I would build a life so far beyond his small-minded judgment that one day he would choke on his own words when he realized what he had thrown away. I walked down the street with my breath fogging in front of me, clutching my coat tighter, the glow of the Christmas lights from the houses around me, feeling almost mocking, like the entire neighborhood was celebrating together while I was cast out into the cold. The snowflakes stung my face, but the ache inside me was worse. And with each step, I thought back to the years I had spent trying to earn a place in that house, the countless holidays where I put on a smile, despite being treated as though I was never enough. I remembered being 16 and staying up late studying in the kitchen, only for my father to come downstairs, glance at me, and mutter that no matter how many books I read, I'd never be as successful as my brother. I remembered the time I lost my first job, and he told me I had embarrassed the family, that my sister would never let something like that happen, because she was raised with ambition. Those words cut then, but I buried the pain and kept trying, kept hoping that if I just worked harder, if I just stayed quiet and helpful, eventually I would earn respect. But now, standing under the yellow street lamp with snow falling around me, I understood something I never had before. Nothing I did would ever change his view of me. He needed me to be the failure, the disappointment, the one he could point to and say, "See, not everyone turns out right." My existence as the scapegoat gave him a twisted sense of superiority. and no amount of proving myself would rewrite the role he had assigned me. That realization both shattered me and set me free. I thought of my mother, who sat at that table silent, her eyes darting between me and him, her lips pressed tight. She had always tried to keep peace, always urged me to ignore his harsh words, to not take things so personally, as though indifference could erase years of neglect. But tonight she said nothing, and that silence was the final answer I needed. She chose her comfort over my dignity, and for the first time I saw her not as my protector, but as someone who had enabled him by never standing up. I walked until my toes went numb, until I reached the bus stop at the corner, and as I waited under the flickering shelter light, I pulled out my phone. My hand shook as I typed a message to a friend I hadn't seen in months. "Do you have space for me tonight? I can't stay at home anymore." I hesitated before pressing send, worried I would be a burden. But then I realized my father had just branded me a leech in front of everyone. If I survived that humiliation, I could survive the vulnerability of asking for help. The message sent, and a few minutes later, her reply came, simple and kind. "Of course. Come over. You're family to me." Reading those words, something broke inside me. But instead of pain, it was relief, like a chain snapping. Maybe blood family had failed me, but I had chosen family too. People who saw me not as a leech, but as someone worth loving. The bus arrived, its brakes screeching against the icy road, and as I climbed aboard with a small bag of belongings, I promised myself this: I would no longer beg for a place at a table where I was unwanted. I would carve out my own space, my own life, and when the day came that they realized I was gone for good, they would understand that their rejection wasn't my shame. It was their loss. The bus rocked gently as it rolled through the quiet, snow-covered streets, the hum of the engine mixing with the muffled chatter of a few passengers scattered across the seats, and I sat there staring out the fogged window, replaying every second of the dinner in my head. My father's voice kept echoing, sharp and unforgiving, but what hurt more was the stillness that followed. No one rushing to my defense, no one even shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, as though they had all silently agreed that he was right. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and thought back to how many years I had been warned never to cause trouble, never to make a scene, and how I had learned to swallow my feelings for the sake of keeping family peace. That peace, I realized now, was nothing but a performance, a facade that only worked if I accepted being the punchline, and I had accepted it for so long. Through birthdays, where my gifts were brushed aside, through family vacations, where I paid more than my share, but was given the worst room, through every casual dismissal, when I tried to talk about my dreams and was told they were unrealistic. It was a slow erosion, the kind you don't even notice, until one day you look in the mirror and barely recognize the person you've become. Tonight forced me to see it clearly. The bus hissed to a stop, letting on a young couple carrying bags of presents, their laughter filling the air, and for a moment I envied them. Envied the ease, the belonging, the sense of being wanted. But then another thought crept in. Maybe they weren't as perfect as they seemed either. Maybe everyone was carrying secrets behind their smiles. I straightened in my seat and let myself imagine what my own life could look like if I stopped begging for crumbs of approval and started building my own table. I had always been told I was too sensitive, too dramatic, too stubborn, but maybe those very traits could become strengths. Sensitivity could make me empathetic. Stubbornness could keep me going when things got hard. Drama. Well, drama was what made me fight for something bigger than the quiet little box they wanted to keep me in. By the time I reached my friend's neighborhood, I had made a decision. I would not go back tomorrow with an apology. I would not try to patch things up for the sake of appearances. I would not play the role they had written for me anymore. My friend greeted me at the door with open arms, pulling me into the warmth of her apartment, the smell of cinnamon and pine instantly wrapping around me. And for the first time that night, I felt my shoulders drop. She didn't ask for explanations, didn't pry. She just handed me a blanket and set a mug of tea in my hands. as if to say, "You don't need to earn your place here. It already exists." That small act of kindness undid me more than my father's cruelty. It showed me what family was supposed to feel like. Later, lying on her couch, listening to the muffled city sounds outside, I stared at the ceiling and thought about what came next. The old me would have spent the night planning how to fix things, how to prove myself worthy again. But I realized there was nothing left to fix. This wasn't my shame to carry. It was theirs. And if they couldn't see my value, I would. Stop trying to shine in their shadow. I began to sketch out a future in my mind. One where I saved every dollar to get my own place. One where I surrounded myself with people who wanted me there. One where Christmas dinners were full of warmth because I created that warmth myself. It wouldn't happen overnight. I knew that. There would be lonely mornings, tight budgets, doubts that whispered I was making a mistake. But even those struggles sounded better than sitting at that long table again, waiting for my father's next public humiliation. I had been cast out, yes, but in being cast out, I had been handed the gift of freedom, and that thought carried me into sleep with a strange, quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. When morning came, I woke to the faint hum of traffic outside, my friend's apartment, and the soft clinking of dishes in her kitchen. And for a fleeting moment, I forgot where I was, until the memory of last night came rushing back with such force. It nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. My father's words replayed like a broken record. "You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." And I felt the sting all over again, the same heaviness in my chest. But now there was no familiar ceiling above me, no childhood room to retreat into. Instead, there was a borrowed blanket, a couch that sagged a little in the middle, and the realization that I had officially crossed a threshold. I wasn't going back. My friend walked in, holding 2 mugs of coffee, her hair messy, her smile soft, and sat down beside me without needing to say anything. And that silence was a balm, compared to the suffocating silence of my family's dinner table. She asked if I wanted to talk, and I did, slowly at first, fumbling over the details. But once the words began spilling out, it was like a dam had broken. I told her about the years of being overlooked, the cruel comparisons, the constant reminder that I was less. And as I spoke, I realized just how much I had bottled up, how much I had convinced myself that this was normal, that this was what family looked like. By the time I finished, there were tears on my cheeks and anger in my voice. But for once, I didn't feel embarrassed for showing it. She listened without judgment. And when she finally spoke, she said something that made me sit straighter. You know, sometimes leaving isn't failure. Sometimes it's the first real win. Those words stuck to me the entire day. As I showered and changed into the spare clothes she lent me. As I scrolled through rental listings on my phone with shaky hands. As I wrote out a list of what I'd need to survive on my own, I kept repeating it. Leaving is a win. My father thought he had stripped me of power by humiliating me. But what he didn't realize was that in forcing me out, he had also forced me to stop living small. I spent the next week in her apartment, helping with chores, job hunting, and piecing together a plan. It wasn't glamorous. I shared her tiny kitchen table, folded blankets every morning, and tried to stretch my savings further than they wanted to go. But it was mine. It was honest. And it was built without begging for permission. Meanwhile, messages from my family began trickling in. My brother texted once, short and curt. "Dad's still mad. Just give it time." My sister sent a photo of the family gathered around the tree. Everyone smiling, except for the empty chair where I should have been, with no caption, as though to guilt me into returning. My mother left a voicemail that was both weary and cold. "You know how your father is. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Come home and let's move past this." Every word dripped with the expectation that I'd bend, that I'd swallow my pride and return to play the scapegoat. But for the first time, I didn't feel tempted. Their home wasn't my home anymore. And then came the day I found a small studio apartment on the edge of town. It was barely bigger than a shoebox, with creaky floors and a leaky faucet. But when I signed the lease and held the key in my palm, I felt something I hadn't in years. Control. I moved in with 2 suitcases, a second-hand mattress, and determination as my only real furniture. But it didn't matter. It was mine. The first night, I lay on the floor surrounded by unpacked boxes, eating cheap takeout straight from the container, and I laughed. I laughed because my father had tried to reduce me to nothing, and yet here I was, starting over, not as a leech, but as someone capable of surviving without him. I knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be months of scraping by, of long nights working overtime, of moments when loneliness crept in. But I also knew I had walked through humiliation and rejection and come out the other side still standing. Few weeks later, my father tried to call me himself. I let it ring out. The voicemail he left was short, clipped. His voice the same mix of pride and disdain. "If you're done sulking, you can come back, but things will have to change." I played it once, twice, then deleted it without replying. He still didn't understand. I wasn't sulking. I wasn't waiting for him to change his mind. I was gone, and I was never coming back to the life where I was small, quiet, and ashamed of existing. I had chosen myself, and that choice, for once, felt more like family than any Christmas dinner ever had. The months that followed tested me in ways I never could have predicted, but they also revealed a strength I hadn't realized was buried inside me. My little studio apartment became both my battlefield and my sanctuary, the place where I confronted loneliness, fear, and doubt, but also the place where I began to stitch together a life that was truly mine. At night, when the radiator rattled and the shadows stretched across the chipped walls, I sometimes cried quietly into my pillow, mourning not just the loss of family, but the loss of the fantasy that one day I would finally be seen, finally be loved by them in the way I deserved. But each morning I rose anyway, brushed my hair, brewed cheap coffee, and reminded myself that survival itself was an act of defiance. My father's words, "You're a leech," echoed like a curse, but with every rent payment made on my own, with every grocery bag carried up 3 flights of stairs, with every bill I managed to cover without asking anyone for help, I rewrote that curse into proof of my independence. Work became my lifeline. I threw myself into every shift, staying late, volunteering for extra hours, and using the money to slowly replace the emptiness of my apartment with small signs of stability. A second-hand bookshelf, a thrifted table, a plant that sat by the window and tilted toward the sun like it believed in brighter days. Each little purchase felt like reclaiming a piece of dignity. My friends, those who had always been there in the background, started to gather around me more, inviting me to dinners, checking in when they hadn't heard from me, reminding me that family could be chosen, not assigned. One evening, as we sat crammed around my tiny table, sharing pizza and laughter, I realized something extraordinary. I felt safer in that cramped apartment, filled with mismatched chairs and borrowed plates, than I had ever felt in the sprawling dining room of my parents' house. Safety wasn't about walls or possessions. It was about being with people who wanted me there, who didn't measure my worth against impossible standards, or use my presence as a foil for their pride. Meanwhile, the messages from home never really stopped. Some were laced with guilt. My mother telling me she worried about me out there all alone. My sister posting family photos with captions like, "Not the same without everyone," while others carried sharp edges, like my father's sporadic calls that grew angrier each time I didn't answer. "You're being dramatic. You're tearing this family apart. We took care of you for years, and this is how you repay us?" But the truth was clear to me now. They hadn't taken care of me. They had tolerated me, controlled me, and twisted that tolerance into a weapon. I thought of all the times they had labeled me ungrateful, lazy, weak, when in reality, I had been carrying more weight than they ever saw. Quietly working, quietly supporting, quietly sacrificing. They only called me a leech because I refused to feed their illusions anymore. The turning point came in spring. A few months after I had moved into my apartment, I received a letter in the mail, handwritten in my father's unmistakable script. My hands shook as I opened it, half expecting another condemnation, but instead it was colder than I imagined. It wasn't an apology. It was an ultimatum. He wrote that if I wanted to remain part of this family, I had to return home, accept his authority, and prove myself useful. Otherwise, I would be cut out entirely. No inheritance, no visits, no mention in future gatherings. He thought he was holding power over me, dangling consequences like chains. But what he didn't realize was that I had already freed myself. I didn't need his money, his name, or his approval. I folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and tucked it into a drawer, not as a reminder of what I had lost, but as evidence of what I had escaped. Instead of breaking me, that letter pushed me further. I enrolled in night classes to finish a certification I had put off for years because my father always said it was pointless. I began to save, little by little, with the dream of one day owning something bigger than a shoebox apartment, and as the weeks passed, my confidence grew. I noticed how I carried myself differently at work, how I spoke up more in meetings, how I no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living under the weight of someone else's disappointment. I was living for myself, and then came the day I ran into my brother at the grocery store. He looked startled to see me, almost guilty, as though the silence between us had grown heavier than he'd expected. We stood there awkwardly by the canned goods aisle. And finally he said, "You look different. Happier, maybe." I wanted to tell him everything, that happiness wasn't the right word, that it was fierceness, resilience, hard-earned peace. But instead, I just smiled and said, I really am. He nodded slowly, and though he didn't apologize, I could see something flicker in his expression. Recognition that I hadn't withered without them. Recognition that I had survived. That night, as I lit a candle on my little thrifted table and sat down to a simple dinner, I felt the weight of my father's words one last time and realized they no longer had power over me. He had called me a leech, but leeches survive. They adapt. They find a way to live despite everything. And if surviving meant leaving behind the people who refused to see my worth, then survival was the bravest choice I had ever made. Summer came, and with it a strange shift I hadn't expected. The city streets buzzed with life, children shrieking as they ran through sprinklers, couples sitting at cafe tables with sunglasses perched on their heads. And I found myself caught between two worlds. One where I was still piecing together the shards of my old life, and another where I was quietly building something entirely new. My studio apartment no longer looked like a stranger's space. It was filled now with the rhythm of my own routines. A second-hand rug softened the creaky floors. Fresh flowers from the Saturday market brought colour to the chipped windowsill. And a corkboard hung above my desk, covered with sticky notes and scribbled goals. Finish certification by December. Save $5,000. No contact. Shares freedom. Every time I glanced at those words, I felt grounded. But the silence from my family grew heavier in a different way. My father had stopped calling altogether, but not out of acceptance. It was punishment. My mother left occasional voicemails, each one the same melody of guilt. He's stubborn, but you know he loves you in his way. Don't be so hard. You're still his daughter. I deleted them without replying. My sister started posting photos of family barbecues, captioned, "Family means everything," with a string of heart emojis. And though she never tagged me, the absence was deliberate. Like a knife slipped between my ribs. They wanted me to feel excluded, to regret walking away. But each attempt only confirmed that my leaving had threatened the balance they had always relied on. I was their scapegoat, and without me at the table, they had no one left to point to. When things went wrong, at work I began to thrive. I was offered more responsibility, not because I begged for it, but because people saw the effort I put in. My boss pulled me aside one afternoon and said, "You've got grit. Most people quit when it gets hard, but you don't. That's rare." Those words nearly undid me, because they were the opposite of everything my father had ever told me. For years I'd been branded the weak one, the failure, the leech, and here was someone recognizing my strength. That recognition lit something in me I hadn't dared to claim before. Pride. Real, honest pride in myself. The nights were the hardest though. Sometimes, lying in bed with the hum of the city outside my window, I would let the loneliness wash over me, remembering the sound of my mother's laughter in the kitchen, or the smell of pine from the family tree. Memory has a way of softening the edges, and I had to remind myself not to rewrite history into something it wasn't. Yes, there were moments of love, moments of comfort, but they had always been conditional. My father's toast on Christmas wasn't a sudden cruelty. It was the culmination of years of erosion. I whispered that to myself on the loneliest nights. It wasn't sudden. It was always there. By fall, something shifted again. My certification was nearly complete, and I had saved enough to consider upgrading from my studio. I visited open houses, walking through small apartments with better light and sturdier walls. And each time I stepped inside, I pictured a future where I hosted my own Christmas dinner, one where the table was filled with friends, laughter, and chosen family. That dream pushed me harder. I took on freelance work in the evenings, taught myself new skills, and kept stacking bricks on the foundation of a life I had been told I wasn't capable of building. Then, in late November, I received a message from an unknown number. It was my father. The text was brief, but it jolted me like a live wire. "Your cousin's wedding is next week. Family only. If you don't show up, don't bother coming back at all." For a long time, I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. He still didn't get it. He still believed he had the authority to decide whether I existed in the family or not. He thought I would drop everything, crawl back, endure his cutting glances and subtle insults just to prove I was still worthy of being counted. But the truth was, I had already built a life outside of his approval. My worth wasn't in his hands anymore. I didn't reply. Instead, I blocked the number. The next morning, I bought a second-hand dining table. Scratched and worn, but solid. I spent hours sanding it, painting it, making it my own. And when I stood back and looked at it in the middle of my little apartment, I realized that table meant more to me than the polished mahogany one in my father's dining room ever had. His table was built on control, silence, and humiliation. Mine was built on survival, choice, and freedom. As December rolled in, and the city lit up with strings of lights, I knew Christmas was coming again. A year since the night that changed everything, and this time, I wouldn't be walking away from a table where I didn't belong. I would be sitting at my own, surrounded by people who saw me, who valued me, who understood that leaving wasn't weakness. It was the first step toward a life that was finally mine. Christmas approached with an almost surreal weight that year, as though the calendar itself was testing me, asking if I was still the woman who left her father's table, humiliated and trembling, or if I had become someone entirely new. The city dressed itself in garlands and lights, shop windows glowing with reds and golds, and I found myself wandering through the streets after work, watching families carry shopping bags, children tugging at mittened hands, couples taking selfies under the big tree in the square. A year ago, those sights would have hollowed me out, reminded me of everything I thought I had lost. But this year, I felt something different. I felt anticipation, not for the old traditions that once left me cold, but for the ones I was about to create. I spent weeks preparing my small apartment for the holiday. It was still modest, but it had grown into a place that reflected me. The thrifted rug now bore the marks of laughter-filled nights with friends. The bookshelf was lined with novels I had collected secondhand, and the little plant by the window had grown taller, reaching stubbornly for the light like it knew it belonged. I strung lights around the window, bought a tiny artificial tree, and decorated it with mismatched ornaments from discount bins, each one chosen with care, each one representing the life I was piecing together from scratch. As I hung them, I thought of my father's perfect, pristine tree back home, the one that was always color coordinated, staged for photographs, never touched by real warmth. My tree wasn't perfect, but it was mine. The invitations went out quietly. To my friend who had taken me in that first night, to a few co-workers who didn't have family nearby, to a neighbor who always left cookies by my door. I didn't call it Christmas dinner. I called it a gathering, because that's what it truly was. A gathering of people who had chosen each other, people who weren't bound by obligation or shame, but by kindness, respect, and presence. As the day drew closer, I stocked up on groceries, bought folding chairs, and scrubbed every inch of the apartment until it gleamed. I wanted this night to stand as proof, not to my father, not to my mother, not to anyone who doubted me, but to myself. Proof that I was not what they said I was. The night finally came. Snow fell outside, soft and relentless, while inside my little apartment glowed with warmth. The table I had sanded and painted stood in the center, covered with dishes I had cooked myself. Nothing extravagant, but hearty and real. My guests arrived carrying laughter, bottles of wine, plates of food to share. As coats were hung and glasses were filled, the air filled with chatter and music. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like an outsider watching happiness happen to other people. I was in it. I was part of it. I was the one who created it. At one point, as we sat around the table, someone raised a glass and said, "To new traditions." Everyone echoed it, smiling, and I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Not the hot, humiliating tears I had swallowed at my father's table, but tears of pride, of belonging, of joy. I glanced at the empty chair in the corner, the one I had left unoccupied, not because anyone was missing, but because it reminded me of the seat I had once been forced to abandon. That chair was no longer a symbol of rejection. It was a reminder that sometimes being pushed out is the only way to find the door to freedom. And then, as laughter filled the room and candles burned low, my phone buzzed on the counter. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. It was my sister. A photo of my family's Christmas dinner lit up the screen. My father at the head of the table, glass raised, everyone smiling stiffly. The caption read, "Another perfect year." I stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at my own table. My guests were laughing so hard that tears streamed down their faces. Someone had spilled wine, and we were mopping it up with paper towels. The music was a little too loud. It wasn't perfect. It was better. Without hesitation, I deleted the photo. My life was no longer measured by the yardstick of their staged perfection. My life was messy, loud, imperfect, and completely, entirely mine. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from something. I felt like I was running toward it. And as I sat back down, raising my glass to the people who had become my true family, I thought to myself, this is the revenge, not anger, not payback, not proving them wrong. The revenge is joy. The revenge is peace. The revenge is building a life so full, so real, that they cannot touch it, no matter what they say. That Christmas, I finally understood. Being cast out of their world was the greatest gift I had ever been given. As the last guest left that night, pulling on coats and scarves and stepping out into the snow-dusted street, I stood in the doorway with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching their taillights disappear into the distance. The laughter still echoed in my little apartment. The smell of roasted vegetables and mulled wine lingered in the air, and the candles flickered low on the table. I closed the door and leaned against it, overwhelmed by a sensation I hadn't felt in years. Fullness. Not the kind that comes from food or gifts, but the kind that comes from being surrounded by people who truly see you. I walked slowly around the apartment, clearing dishes, folding chairs, humming softly under my breath, and at every turn I thought, this is mine. This life is mine. Yet in the quiet that followed, memories pressed against me like ghosts. I thought, back to that night a year ago. My father's glass raised, his voice sharp, his words slicing through the air. "You're a leech. You can't stay here anymore." I remembered the look on my mother's face, her silence louder than any condemnation. I remembered my siblings staring, frozen, as though my humiliation was entertainment. Those memories used to crush me, but now they felt different. They were a marker, a line in the sand. Before that night, I had lived my life hoping to belong to them. After that night, I had begun building a life where I belonged to myself. Still, part of me wondered if they thought about me, if they noticed my absence beyond the empty chair at their table. Did my father ever replay that moment in his mind and feel even a flicker of regret? Did my mother lie awake at night, remembering the look on my face as I stood to leave? Did my sister ever glance at her photos and see not a perfect family, but the hollow truth behind the smiles? I would never know, because they never reached out with anything real. Every message that came was wrapped in manipulation or pride. Never vulnerability, never love. And I had stopped answering long ago. In the months that followed that Christmas, my life began to stretch and grow in ways I hadn't expected. My certification turned into a promotion. My paycheck increased, and slowly I began to save, not just for survival, but for possibility. I took weekend trips with friends, explored parts of the city I had never allowed myself to enjoy, and even started a small side project, writing about my journey, sharing pieces of my story with others who had been cast out by their families. To my surprise, people responded. Strangers messaged me, saying they felt less alone because of my words, that they too had been called names, cut off, pushed out, and had found strength in leaving. For the first time in my life, my voice, once silenced at my father's table, was being heard. And then something unexpected happened. One evening, as I sorted through the mail, I found a thick envelope with my parents' address on the return label. I nearly tossed it into the trash unopened, but something made me slit it open. Inside was a wedding invitation, my sister's. The words were scripted in gold, the venue lavish, the message polite but cold. No handwritten note, no acknowledgement of the year that had passed. Just a formal declaration that the family would gather again, with or without me. At first, I laughed bitterly. The audacity of it. To exile me one Christmas, and then send me an invitation the next, as though nothing had happened. But then a different thought crept in. Maybe they expected me to show up, to play the part of the grateful prodigal daughter, to prove that they still had power over me. I set the invitation on the table and stared at it for a long time. I imagined walking into that hall, the eyes turning, the whispers beginning. I imagined my father's smug glance, my mother's tight smile, my siblings' rehearsed lines about moving on. And I imagined myself shrinking, reverting, handing them back the power I had fought so hard to reclaim. That vision made me sick. So instead, I took the invitation, folded it once, and slid it into the same drawer where I had kept my father's ultimatum letter, not as a keepsake, but as evidence of how far I had come, of the things I had chosen to leave behind. That spring, I hosted another dinner at my place, this time larger, louder, brighter. Friends brought friends, neighbors brought desserts, and my little apartment pulsed with life. At one point, I stood back, glass in hand, watching the room swell with laughter and conversation, and it hit me like a wave. This was my family. Not the one I was born into, but the one I had built. Each person in that room wanted me there, not for appearances, not for control, not as a scapegoat, but simply because I was me. The revenge, I realized, wasn't in cutting them out. It wasn't in anger or bitterness or even in proving them wrong. The revenge was this: joy, a life so full of love and purpose that it eclipsed the pain of what they had taken. A life where their absence no longer felt like a wound, but like space I had filled with better, truer things. A life where I could finally breathe. And as the evening wound down and the candles burned low, I thought back to my father's words one last time. You're a leech. He had meant it to destroy me, to strip me of dignity. Instead, it had become the spark that pushed me to claim my independence. And now, standing in the glow of my own home, surrounded by laughter, I whispered, softly to myself, I am not your leech. I never was. I am my own. That night, I blew out the last candle and climbed into bed with a smile on my face, the kind of smile that comes not from perfection, but from peace. And for the first time, I knew with certainty I would never sit at his table again. I didn't need to. I had built my own. The years that followed carried me further from that night than I ever imagined possible. What began as survival in a shoebox apartment became a foundation for a life I could stand proudly on. I moved into a bigger place with sunlight pouring through wide windows, filled it with furniture, chosen not for appearances, but for comfort. And every corner of it told a story of resilience. My story. I traveled, worked hard, made mistakes, and grew stronger because of them. Each milestone, no matter how small, was proof that I was not what my father tried to brand me as. I was not a leech. I was not weak. I was not disposable. Over time, the noise from my family faded into the background. The calls stopped. The photos and invitations stopped. Even the guilt-drenched messages from my mother stopped. They retreated into their polished house and their carefully staged traditions. And I built something raw, messy, but alive. There were nights I felt the ache of absence. Yes, but there were more nights when I felt gratitude. Gratitude that I had been forced to walk away before I wasted another decade, begging for scraps of love that would never come. I thought of my father sometimes, imagined him sitting at the head of his table with his glass raised high, still convinced of his authority, still blind to the gift he had given me. Because in the end, his cruelty had freed me. His rejection had carved out space for my real life to grow. His words, meant to cut me down, became the very fire that carried me forward. The last time I passed by their house, years later, I slowed down only for a moment. The windows glowed warm. Laughter spilled faintly into the night, but it no longer pierced me the way it once had. I didn't wonder if they missed me. I didn't wonder if they regretted. I only thought, that chapter is closed. Then I walked on, toward the life I had made, toward the family I had chosen, toward the future that was entirely mine, and that, I realized, was the truest revenge. Not anger, not bitterness, not even triumph over them. The revenge was the peace I carried, the joy I built, the freedom I claimed. The revenge was never needing their table again, because I had built my own, and it was more than enough.